Welcome to Religion Wise. I'm your host, Chip Gruen. Well, I'm very excited to welcome back a guest who we've had on the podcast previously, Dr. Tad Robinson, who is professor of philosophy here at Muhlenberg College. You might remember that he talked about the philosophy of religion in Season 1, Episode 4. If you didn't get a chance to listen to that episode, I invite you to go back and listen. Not that it's necessary for this conversation, but can provide a little bit of context and additional information on the philosophy of religion more generally. The reason that he's back today, though, is that he, through his recent scholarship and teaching, is reframing some of those questions from philosophy of religion and considering them from a new angle. The central way he's doing this is thinking about these things as spiritual practice, as thinking about spirituality rather than religion. And this is really important, and I think we teaching in the liberal arts college get a front row view of this, is that in the last few decades, the percentage of people who don't claim religious affiliation or religious identity in their matriculation materials has gone up dramatically from the mid-single digits to about 40% of students entering. So the old cliche is that people will say that they are spiritual but not religious. Dr. Robinson is taking that question seriously and reframing a lot of the questions that he asks about religious belief and practice along the lines of what we might think of as more individual, less institutional, less corporate structures. So, for example, the practice of prayer, meditation, yoga, other things that people might do outside of a religious institution, and they just do on their own. And so the set of questions that he asks about those practices is oftentimes very different than what we might think of when we think of questions, philosophy of religion questions from a traditional perspective. The other reason I find this topic really interesting, and I find Dr. Robinson to be a great interlocutor for me, is that being a religious studies professor who is influenced a lot by history of religions, sociological methods, anthropological methods, the questions that he asks are just fundamentally different. Now, religious studies as a field casts a very wide net and can include a lot of different methods. But the kinds of questions that he asks and the kinds of analysis that he does just differs really radically from the kinds of things I think about with students in my classes or in my own writing and research. The final note I want to make here is just a note of clarity. Because this is audio only, you might not pick up on the usage of a word, and that word is nuns. We refer to it quite a lot, and it's explained a little bit, but I just want to make it really clear. When we refer to nuns, that is N-O-N-E-S, meaning those people who mark their religious affiliation as nun. This is a term that you see used in polling, in data collection, that people will mark nun or write nun as a religious affiliation. And so they have sometimes been referred to as the nuns, which of course is in contrast to nuns, N-U-N-S, the Catholic female religious individuals who live a life dedicated to God. The nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and the nuns, N-U-N-S, are obviously very, very different and distinct from one another. So just that point of clarity as you listen to the episode. I hope you enjoy listening to the episode as much as I've enjoyed thinking about it with Dr. Robinson. Tad Robinson, thanks for coming on Religion Wise.
Well, thanks for having me.
So astute listeners will remember that you were on Season 1, Episode 4, and the title of that episode was Philosophy of Religion, and we talked about this subfield of philosophy, which is, of course, the context of your own professional work and the context of our conversation today. But in your recent research and course design, you're choosing to focus not on religion as the category of central concern, but instead on the word or on the category spirituality. Why did you choose to reframe the way that you consider belief and practice around that term, spirituality, instead of religion?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this initially primarily in terms of kind of meeting students where they were with respect to the course, philosophy of religion course. And, one of the things I had noticed was that the term religion, has over the last few years in particular kind of come to connote a set of institutions or ideas about institutions and rules and things that students just weren't very interested in. And so I was sort of thinking about ways to kind of meet them where they were at. And so I thought, well, students and the public at large seem to see spirituality in much more positive terms. People are interested in spirituality. This is a term that kind of has a positive valence with people. And so I was thinking, well, what if I kind of reframed the course with a different title and maybe just change some of the terminology? And I think initially I was thinking I could, teach a philosophy of religion course titled or framed around spirituality. So that was the initial idea. But when I made the decision to do that and started really getting into the nitty gritty of like, okay, well, I'm going to have an account of kind of what spirituality is and kind of general, and maybe how that differs a little bit from religion as I frame the course for students. I started to realize that this framing affords some new opportunities for thinking about, philosophical topics, right? And so that was where I sort of started off. So once I started thinking about this, I thought, okay, well, what is spirituality, right? And obviously, this is a super complicated term. It means a million things to a million different people, and so I had to kind of circumscribe this a little bit. And so, as I was thinking about what spirituality is, or at least a way to operationalize it for the course, I started thinking about, well, okay, one, like people use this term in a really general way. So however we think about spirituality, it's got to be what I would call kind of trans-religious, right? So it's got to be something that we can talk about, a Buddhist spirituality and a New Age spirituality and maybe a secular spirituality and a traditional, more sort of traditional kind of Western kinds of spirituality. So that was one kind of limitation. Another kind of limitation was, had to do with the fact that why do people care about spirituality? My sense is that, people are motivated to think about spirituality, because there's some sort of problem, right? That, they sort of sense that there's some sort of gap between the way the world is and the way it could be or should be, right? And so I think that's a sort of really general way of talking about an experience a lot of us have, probably a lot of the time, which is just to say why are things this way? Or why did I do that and not that? Or I wish I hadn't done that. Or here's something I could do in the future. What am I going to have to do? So there's sort of this gap between the way the world is and the way it could or should be that I think we're constantly navigating. And that's, I think, a pretty deep element of the human condition in a sense, right? So I think that does connect well with kind of why people will be looking towards spirituality or looking for spirituality. Kind of a third element that I was thinking about is, how spirituality might differ from, a life hack, right? Or how spirituality might differ from an intervention, like a psychological intervention or clinical intervention, right? In the sense that people have lots of problems, right? And so there's different ways of approaching those. So how does spirituality differ in these kinds of ways? And differ from these kinds of phenomena? And, I think, as I was thinking about it and reading about this, one of the things that spirituality seems to be, at least for many people, is about sort of fundamental changes to kind of who we are, right? And the way we understand things, right? So, these aren't intended as sort of short-term fixes, right? They're not intended to deal with what we might think was pathological problems. These are sort of, efforts to deal with the world, in light of kind of who we are in some sense. And then sort of the last thing that was kind of driving me was this observation, spirituality is totally practical, right? That spirituality, is sort of most sort of paradigmatically kind of exemplified in practices like prayer and meditation and yoga and, fasting and all these kinds of things that we associate with kind of religious practice, I think. So kind of taking all of that into account, I was like, okay, well, let's operationalize spirituality for the purposes of this course, in terms of a positive effort. So what I ended up doing in terms of operationalizing the term for the course and my thinking was to think about it this way, right? To think about spirituality as a practical orientation toward a more fulfilled and harmonious life. And sort of in a little more detail, the idea is to understand it as an orientation towards a life where somebody's actions and desires and understanding and priorities and emotions cohere not only with one another, but with the way the world is and with those things that are recognized as substantively valuable within it.
Wow, that sounds like a philosopher's definition.
Hey,
So I want to follow up on this a little bit, because if I'm understanding correctly, like on the one hand, that there was almost a market-driven approach to thinking about the course, philosophy of religion, and as you said, meeting students where they're at. And so that demanded a sort of a categorical reconstruction of how you're approaching the course. But on the other hand, you are approaching, I think you'll agree, is a somewhat similar body of material reframed from a different perspective. So I guess I want to get at your strategy here. I mean, are that equal parts of those things? Is this about marketability, or do you fundamentally see these beliefs and practices, these approaches in a different way as you've sought to reframe the category?
Yeah, I think both, and it was unexpected that the reframing this would have significant consequences for thinking about traditional topics and traditional philosophical questions, right? So, I think just to give a couple of examples, right? So on the one hand, I think that you can do a lot of what you might normally do in a traditional philosophy of religion course in a course on philosophy and spirituality or philosophy of spirituality. But I think that like those kind of traditional topics, arguments for God's existence, for example, right? Or problem of evil, right? These become not the primary questions. They don't become the first questions that come up, right? So if you're thinking about spirituality, you're thinking about a person kind of trying to transform their lives in light of their values and, what they regard to be true. The questions are human-centered as opposed to kind of, universe-centered or external-centered. And so, for example, you're going to have to focus on, well, what is it that people do? Right. So, what are these spiritual practices or spiritual exercises, and why do people do those things? Right. In particular, as opposed to something else. Right. And when you ask those kinds of questions, issues of like what the self is kind of come up automatically, because the question is, well, you're transforming yourself. Well, what is that? Right. And so, looking back at the history of philosophy, you see lots of different kinds of stories about what self-transformation is, right? So, to give a couple of examples, one, you might think of as self-transformation as self-discovery, right? So there's a lot of discussion in the contemporary world, right, about like finding the true self, where that is like, hey, your true self is there, you just got to dig it out, right? Another model of thinking about that is sort of self-mastery, right? So where the idea is that, hey, the individual is this disjointed or multifaceted sort of being, and then what we need to do in order to master the self is kind of push aside those parts of us that don't contribute to our well-being or our flourishing or aren't consistent with our values, right? There's another way of thinking about this transformation in terms of creation of the self, right? So where, hey, the self is not this pre-existing thing, like you make yourself, right? So we see this in certain existentialist kinds of writers, but also with contemporary kinds of narrative identity and so on. So, that's one kind of case. Another kind of case has to do with self-knowledge. Again, a traditional philosophical subject that goes back to Socrates, right? But not something that typically comes up in a philosophy of religion course. So what does that mean? Well, when it comes to self-knowledge, one of the things that comes out, at least in a lot of discussions of spiritual practice, is sort of how we don't know what's going on inside of us. Sometimes we don't know what we want, right? We don't know what we really value, right? And that part of this process of digging things out, is coming to know the self, right? And there's an interesting kind of discussion there philosophically, because philosophers have for a long time sort of taken self-knowledge to be something pretty easy, right? But at least according to a lot of people writing on spiritual practices, for example, it's really not, right? So there's an interesting philosophical question there that I think grows right out of these questions of if we're going to focus on spirituality. And there's some other stuff too we can talk about, but that's just a couple of examples.
So I want to get a sense, obviously, as you indicate, a lot of the questions that you're digging into are questions that have backgrounds, philosophical backgrounds, right? There's reading, there are thinkers, there are people who've thought about these, though maybe not exactly in the context of philosophy of religion.
Right.
So I'm curious about how much of what you're doing, again, in both the paper you presented at the American Academy of Religion and in this course redesign, is a part of the contemporary trends in philosophy of religion, or is this Tad Robinson using the freedom of being a professor at a liberal arts college to do and to formulate and imagine the world in new and creative ways, apart from sort of major trends that are going on in the field?
I think, on the one hand, it is sort of, a matter of me sort of trying to plow ahead and sort of find a new way of thinking, right? That said, I mean, there's certainly, I've certainly had resources to draw on, right? So just to give a couple examples, Robert Solomon, who's a pretty well-known philosopher, the University of Texas, wrote a book called Spirituality for the Skeptic. Back in the early 2000s, right? There's been a number of edited collections that have come out on spirituality. There's a recent book that we might talk about a little later by this philosopher named Terence Cuneo called Ritualized Faith, right? Which focuses on kind of liturgical practices in the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? So there is a sort of, burgeoning is maybe overstating it, right? But there is, I think, an interest in and an increasing interest in sort of thinking about spirituality, maybe not as opposed to religion or philosophy of religion, right? But, in conjunction with. So, there's that. And I've had the opportunity to draw on a lot of that material. That said, right, the way that I'm thinking about this in terms of, transformation, models of the transformation of self, models of self-knowledge, right? Maybe thinking about philosophy of habit, for example. These are in some ways stuff that I'm having to kind of come up with and dig out and reformulate and frame myself.
So I want to go back. I mean, and listeners of the podcast will know that I am particularly interested in some of the things that I won't say threw away, but some of the things that you dismissed as being principal to philosophy of religion, that you are defocusing institutions, certain kinds of rules or regulations or structures.
Right.
And religious studies as a field, is very heavily influenced by sociology and anthropology that really center on those kinds of things.
Right.
So I want to, maybe do a disciplinary contrast here, or just think about the ways in which you imagine some of those things that are traditionally in the field of religious studies, of social institutions, social roles, determined identities, ethics, all of those sorts of things, and to see where you see this approach overlapping or not overlapping, or how, for example, a philosophy of spirituality would think about, say, hierarchy or structure, or those questions that you're sort of leaving aside for other disciplines or other courses.
Yeah. I mean, it is true, like focusing on spirituality, at least as I'm thinking about it, is focused on kind of individuals' inner lives, right? And so it is opposed in some sense, or at least doesn't really necessarily draw on sort of sociological or political understandings of humans, right? So that's the case, right? So just to give an example of how that might play out, right? I mean, so say we want to think about meditation, right? And so we're thinking, well, what are the philosophical questions about like meditative practices, right? And so we might think about like, well, I mean, meditation, there's lots of manuals about meditation, right? There's lots of sort of, maybe rule book is the wrong word, but texts that suggest particular ways of meditating for particular kinds of reasons, at particular kind of times, and particular kinds of goals, right? And so, as a philosopher, we can kind of look at that. We can also look at like why, to the extent that we have access to this, why do individuals engage in this? What do individuals think they're doing when they're doing this, right? So all of those are kind of starting with individual actions or sort of, texts that sort of tell us about why an individual might want to do this, right? From a sociological or anthropological perspective, we might say, yeah, but Tad, like why people do things is not always clear to them, right? And we might, sociologists or anthropologists might say, hey, the sort of social forces or the external forces that are acting on a person, right, that's what's really driving their action, right? Or their culture is really driving their action. Like what they think they're doing, inside their own minds is maybe not an accurate story about why they're doing what they're doing, right? And I would just say, like, people are complicated, right? And so, hey, from the perspective that I'm going to start with, right, we're going to start with like, what do these people think they're doing and why are they doing it, as opposed to sort of a sociological or anthropological perspective that says, oh, they're really engaging in something else, right? Maybe they are, right? But we can certainly start with what kinds of reasons they think they're, are driving their action, right?
So let me give you a critique. I'll see how you think about this, because one of the directions that you seem to be going seems to be heavily influenced by psychology of religion. And I wonder how much that work is influencing what you're thinking and how you're thinking. Because if we're thinking about how people's internal processes are working or how they think that they're working on themselves, like those seem to be psychological questions. So that's part one. And in part two, I will often say to my students, I have the privilege of teaching my theory and method for the study of religion this coming term. And when we get to the psychology of religion section, one of the critiques I offer to them after we've gone through and thought about some of these thinkers is that the only way we can get to the inner workings of somebody, a spiritual or religious person talking about their own practice is, in fact, the talking about it, right? The formulating it, the self-reporting that is done. And the case I always try to make for my students is that is a public act in itself, right? Like how one constructs the story of what they're doing or the narrative of their own spiritual practice is itself a performative thing that gets you a little bit away from psychology and more into maybe anthropology or sociology. Mm-hmm, yeah. So tell me about the confluences that you have with psychology and how you would respond to that idea of sort of the public performance of the stories that people tell.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's like, the approach that I'm pursuing is sort of like a psychological approach to religion in the sense that it's focused on the individual, right, as opposed to sort of a larger group, and that it's focused on kind of the inner kind of life, right? It's not psychological in the sense that it's not I'm not engaging in empirical methods, right? At all, but yeah, there's certainly an overlap, and some of the topics that I'll be taking up are certainly what we would call in philosophy moral psychology, right? So questions of compassion and gratitude and so on. So there is an overlap in some way. That said, right? I mean, with respect to the sort of point about creating one's sort of inner life by telling the story about it. I mean, I think that actually is something that comes out in thinking about habits and self-transformation, right? So one of the things that is sort of philosophy 101 is sort of Aristotle's account of the virtues, right? And how you become brave, right? And so Aristotle's story about how you become brave is not that like you decide to become brave and start thinking brave thoughts, right? It's like you start acting like brave people act, right? And by acting like brave people act, you become brave and you take on the beliefs and dispositions of someone who is courageous, right? By acting like courageous people do, right? So one of the sort of storylines that we kind of get, and I think this is a real tension among philosophers, and I think a lot of people, is a sort of dynamic between inner and outer, right? Where sort of Aristotle's sort of theory of the virtues, and other people have picked this up in variety of ways, right? Is to say like, hey, to change the inner, you need to change the outer first, right? And so we don't always sort of think about things that way. We sort of sometimes think like, well, I want to be different. I should just sort of change my inside, right? I need to change my beliefs. I need to change my dispositions. And sort of the recognition that Aristotle has, right, is to say like, yeah, you can't do that directly, right? You can only change the inside by changing the outside in certain kinds of ways, right? And so I think like your point about like telling the story in some ways is an example of that, right? And there's lots of examples like that. So there's a sort of famous example of John Stuart Mill in his autobiography sort of tells this story about this mental breakdown he has. And he sort of comes to this conclusion. He says, like, I just realized, like, you can't just make yourself happy, right? Like, you can't focus on happy. You can't try to be happy, right? You have to try to do something else. And happiness is sort of a sort of byproduct, right, of pursuing the right kinds of things, right? And so I think that idea of sort of is related, right? Where if you want to do certain kinds of things, specifically things related to your inner life, right, and changing kind of who you are, you can't decide to do those. You can't aim to do that, right? You have to do something else, and as a byproduct, those changes will happen, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think the example you talk about is precisely one of those. But I don't think everything's like that. But I think lots of cases when it comes to spirituality are.
Okay, so if we take that example again of the story that people tell about their own inner lives, right, as being something that is sort of discoverable and we can use as a basis for thinking in a number of different ways. It's interesting to me to think about, to return to our student population, and I think that we can extrapolate out a little bit from our student population to think about Gen Z. Obviously, we teach people mostly who are the 18 to 22-year-old set, though not exclusively, that their thinking on a lot of these questions is different than it was, say, when we were 18 to 22 years old, or when boomers or the silent generation or the greatest generation were 18 to 22 years old. And I've made a little bit of a study of this, just looking at the demographic trends of the matriculation data when our students come in, that when we came to Muhlenberg, that the story was that the population was a third Jewish and a third Catholic and a third of kind of everything else, which is, I don't know, not the way that we think about religious diversity these days, but that was always the story that was told. Mm-hmm. And now if you look at that demographic information, something like 40% don't affiliate at all. And we could talk about, where those people would have been 20 years ago or whatever, but I think that this phenomenon of the nuns, the no religious affiliation, which we could talk about as being connected to or not connected to institutions and rules, but that these people, it's not as if they don't think about the larger questions of meaning and the good life and all of those sorts of things. But I'm curious to get your thoughts, on this population that we have a lot of contact with, and here not so much from a marketing perspective, but how are humans, at least humans, that we encounter in a Northeastern liberal arts college, changing the way that they tell those personal narratives about meaning and order and identity, and how does that connect to this reframing that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that sociologists, others would talk about this as the rise of the nuns, right? So, this change in the way that the American or the North American or the, Western kind of populations are thinking about religion. I think that does play a role here, right? So in saying, as we were starting off, in saying that, students have sort of started to think about religion in sort of ways that I wouldn't have when I was 20 or 30 or 40. I think that does have to do with this shift that's contributing to nuns, right? So yeah, I think that's relevant. And, I think you're also exactly right to say, like, simply because an individual is a nun, right? And so no longer, identifies themselves with a specific, religious label, right? Like, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, like, the kinds of questions that, people who traditionally we would call religious, right, have or are thinking about, right, they don't lose those, right? I mean, I think there are certainly some people out there that, are totally uninterested, right, who might count as a nun, right? But I think a lot of nuns, N-O-N-E, right, a lot of nuns, really do have these same kinds of questions about, like, what's my place in the universe, right? And, how do I fit and how do I understand suffering? And, how should I live and what's good, right? I think all of these questions are pretty common, and simply because one no longer identifies with a particular category, it's not like these questions disappear. So, yeah, I mean, I think people are as hungry as they always have to think about these kinds of things. They're just thinking about them, under different kinds of labels or in different kinds of ways.
It's kind of interesting coming into this conversation. I didn't think that these things were connected at all, but I guess I'm just going through the catalog of courses I'm teaching this term. But the other course I'm teaching is religion and popular culture. Mm-hmm. And one of the premises of that course is that just because people are not or may not necessarily be traditional religious doesn't mean that they're not thinking about those questions. And believe it or not, Taylor Swift or the latest limited series on HBO can contribute to people's feelings or exploration about the purpose of life or what the good life is or any number of other questions, that may have been met traditionally in religious institutions or by religious leadership. So it seems like we are kind of chewing on different sides of the same bone here a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I think is, I guess I'm sort of reframing kind of what I'm doing in courses and rethinking about kind of what the goal is, right, is, there are thousands of years of people's reflections on these big questions, which I think that, a student, right, who sees themselves as a nun or doesn't identify with religious tradition might miss out on the opportunity to explore, right, because they associate the term religion, right, with solely institutions or solely rules and so on, right? And so I think that spirituality, like the term spirituality, presents an opportunity, right, to connect people with questions to some of history's, great kind of thinkers, right, about these difficult and tough questions. So, the hunger for to think about these questions is still there. People's thoughts about them are still there, right? I think spirituality, that moniker, is one way of trying to bring those two things together from a pedagogical point of view.
Yeah, so you use the terms in your research and teaching non-doxastic and or secular, I think, to try to capture some of this. And I think, I will say non-doxastic is a new one for me. I don't think I've seen that in print before, but secular, certainly people will be familiar with. What do these terms mean for you in the work that you're doing, and how are they relevant towards asking some of these questions, in particular secular, because that word is used a lot and loosely and sometimes pejoratively in sort of mainstream discourse.
Yeah, right. So, by non-doxastic, right, just, doxa means believe, right? So we're just talking about kind of non-belief, right? And so in using that term, what I want to get at is the idea that, a person might engage in certain kinds of spiritual exercises without, a substantive, systematic body of belief about the nature of the universe and so on, right? And the same with secularity, right? In the sense I'm sort of using that term in a simplified way just to mean, hey, engaging in these practices in a way that does not presuppose, any kind of specific version of the good or of the nature of reality or anything, right? So what I want to capture is simply the idea that, people might be in this place, right, where they notice in their lives a gap between the way things are and the way they could or should be, and they sort of intuitively, perhaps even, right, sort of try to take some steps, right, to bridge that gap and sort of, make steps towards self-transformation, right, that I think people can totally legitimately do that, right, without having any larger body or a very specific body of outside belief. So that's what I'm trying to kind of get at, right, because in my experience, and I think this comes out in some of the research on nuns, right, it's that, there are people who are just fundamentally suspicious of any kind of universal claims about the world, right, or who are not interested in investigating those, right, yet at the same time, right, might be interested in exploring sort of spiritual practices or spiritual exercises. And so, I think that's a really important group of people to make sure that we're talking to and thinking about, and so that's sort of the root of that kind of language.
So let me give an example to kind of flesh this out. We might imagine somebody who participates in a yoga regimen, right, is a very staunchly interested in the practice of yoga and goes and does this all the time, but might then also call themselves an atheist. Right. And so that on the one hand, that would be a spiritual practice that is doing something that, in the words that you've used, is a transformation of the self or self-discovery or what have you. But on the other hand, is not tied to anything that I would call a cosmological presence out there somewhere.
Yeah, and I think, so I think some people would say, well, that's not spirituality, right? That's health, right? And I think that's an open question, right? So one of the things that I think it's really important not to do, when we start reframing things, is to answer questions before we've asked them, right? Or to answer questions by fiat, by definition, right? And so in thinking about spirituality, like, is that a form of spirituality? Yeah, I think that's an open question. So I was just reading something yesterday where an author was, considering, like, hey, could you engage in yoga, right, without and sort of experience certain kinds of transformation without there being some sort of background story at work of the divine, right? And I think that's an interesting argument. It's an interesting article, and I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's something that we have to have on the table, right? So are there atheist spiritualities? I think that the answer is probably yes, right? And I think that's something that we need to think about. Lots of authors will make Sam Harris is one of these sort of debunkers and atheists who will nonetheless make the case for an atheist kind of spirituality. And I think that's interesting. I think that's something that we need to think more about.
It's also interesting, in my field, where this conversation would naturally go, and you may choose to chime in on this or not, is that when you get the divorcing of the practice of the ritual from that narrative, that this very often can become what people will call appropriation, right? Which will sort of lay at the feet of, late capitalist, colonial enterprise, right? That is sort of taking things, divorcing them from their cultural context and using them for their own devices, which I would say, if what you're thinking about is efficacy, really is not part of this question, right? If you're thinking about efficacy or the narratives that people tell themselves, right? But then that is to go back to the other terminology, more political and social kind of question than it is philosophical question.
Yeah, I think that there's that seems right. I was just reading something the other day called an article called McMindfulness, which was just kind of getting to this point, right? And I don't know. I do think that there's a philosophical angle on it, right? In the sense that you might wonder about, like, well, what are the ethics of appropriation here, right? But yeah, I think in general, this is a different kind of question, that maybe would be more naturally fits in kind of religion studies or elsewhere. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think you can ask that more broadly, right? Ask the question about the separation between the practice and the underlying kind of theory behind it, right? So there is in philosophy a sort of small literature on, prayer without belief, right? Like, could you pray to God if you didn't believe that God exists, right? Or if you were agnostic, right? And, I think, I'm trying to think if this is true, but I think in all of the literature that I'm aware of, the answer is yes, right? The argument is to say, like, yeah, it seems weird, but there's no conceptual obstacle here, right? And in fact, at least a couple of authors will argue, like, in certain kinds of cases, atheists should pray to God, right? So the idea being that, like, in a case where, say a loved one is in a dangerous health situation or something, you're powerless to do anything, right? And you're an atheist, like, the argument is to say, like, hey, it costs you nothing, right, to ask for help, even if you think this help is not there, right? Like, you ought to pursue all possible avenues towards helping your child, for example, right? And if this is an avenue that helps, then you should engage in it. So I'm not saying I endorse that argument, but I do think that it's kind of an interesting kind of argument, and that's one way that some of the issue that you're raising kind of has come up in some of the philosophical literature.
It seems to me like these are not new questions or not new realizations. I mean, as you're talking about this, one of the things that springs to mind is people like stealing the host from a Eucharistic service and using it for their own devices for magic or whatever.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, if you really believe that has the power that the church says it does, you probably wouldn't be stealing it. But again, divorcing it from one kind of narrative and inserting it into another is something that we've seen, or all the magical tablets and things that are dug up from the ancient world that are calling on gods that certainly these people are not adherent to, right? Whether they believe, quote unquote, in them or not is sort of a different question.
I mean, in some ways, it does kind of mirror, right, this conversation about like the term religion, right? So is religion, something that's always good, right? Or is religion something like, hey, it's just a descriptive category and there could be like good categories of religion or bad categories of religion, right? I think we can ask the same questions about spirituality, right? Where we might say like, hey, spirituality just describes something that people do, right? That's focused on their inner lives, right? And their efforts to sort of transform themselves. But like, could there be, ways of doing that are harmful to others or harmful to the self, right? That don't meet the ends that an individual has set for themselves? Like, that seems reasonable to me to say, right? So, I mean, I guess one other note on this, I mean, it's not like there aren't criticisms of certain kinds of spirituality out there, like in various religious traditions. So, I was just reading something the other day about extreme fasting, right? Where, in the 200s and 300s, right? So the early years of sort of the Christian church, right? There's this question, like there's all these ascetics kind of going out and engaging in these extreme practices. And so the kind of question comes up for Vodius and some of these other people, like, well, like how much is too much, right? And so, one of the arguments that kind of comes out during this period is to say, well, like to the extent that you're undermining your ability to kind of focus your attention on God, right? Like your fasting is not serving its purposes. And what's kind of interesting is you see exactly that same objection, right, in Buddhist discourses, right? Like what counts as sort of going too far when it comes to your spiritual practices. So I give that just as an example of kind of, I guess what you might think of as like intra-religious kind of objections to certain kinds of spiritual exercises.
Is the class Spirituality and Philosophy a replacement for or an augmentation to your traditional philosophy of religion course? Could you imagine a world in which both of these in your rotation, because they're doing things in a way that's different enough, right, that they're getting at different philosophical questions?
I wouldn't have said that at the beginning of this process, but I would now. I mean, one of the things that, I think you learn as a teacher, is that good philosophical questions come out of concrete experiences. And, I think that framing things in terms of spirituality foregrounds kind of like the things that people do, right? And I think that everybody in the class, will have had some exposure to like things people do to kind of, make themselves who they want to be in some respect, right? In the ways that I'm thinking about spirituality, at least. And so I think that like it'll be a fruitful conversation, but I think that like a second step out of that, right, is like, okay, so we've talked about spirituality. All of a sudden at that point, you might be interested and say like, well, yeah, but why, what kind of grounds do we have for believing that there is any kind of transcendent reality, right? Like, I think that focusing on what we do raises that question in a sort of much more concrete way than just kind of asking it in the first place. And so I think that, some of the traditional kind of philosophical questions that come up in the philosophy of religion, like grow really naturally out of a substantive discussion of spirituality in a way that I hadn't expected, right? So, in this course, we certainly won't talk about arguments for the existence of God in the same way and to the same degree and the same depth that we would in a traditional philosophy of religion course. But I do expect that at least some students will be interested in those in a way that they wouldn't have been otherwise after having, thought about spirituality. So I don't know. I mean, I think, I think that goes for other traditional questions of religious diversity, problems of evil, problems of religious knowledge, and so on. I think that those kinds of questions maybe will have more force, right, for students at the end of a class on the philosophy of spirituality. So I don't know. We'll see if that's right, but that's kind of the way that I've been thinking about it now.
So, sort of as we get towards conclusion here, one of the questions that sort of guides my work at the Institute and is the central question of religion-wise, is thinking about enhancing the conversation of religion in public life, right? That is one of my premises, that we don't generally do a very good job of talking about religious belief and practice, particularly as it gets beyond our own, although I would say that we don't do a very good job of talking about that either. But if we were to move beyond the academy, right? So you, in the rarefied air of your own scholarship and talking to your groups of students, you deal with these questions. Do you feel like if we could somehow wave a wand, right, and change the ways that categories are understood at the public policy level or the governmental level or just in the public conversation about religion and spirituality, if we could reframe that conversation along these lines, A, would that be a good thing? And B, what might that gain for us if we're looking for a more sophisticated conversation of belief and practice in our world?
Yeah, that seems like a really hard question. So, just a couple of thoughts. On the one hand, I totally agree that public discourse about religion in the United States is poor. It's really not done very well. And, one of the things that I sort of think sometimes is like, if an alien came down and only watched kind of like popular media and that was everything they learned about religion, they would assume that pretty much like there in the United States, there are, evangelical Christians and there are Roman Catholics. And that covers everybody, right? Like, and there's sort of the other maybe, right? But I think, that's certainly not the case, right? And the interests of people in those groups themselves are not unified in any case. So, yeah, I totally agree that the discourse is not well done. Is spirituality a term that might be useful? I don't know, because I think that term is already so broad. There's a really great book on the sort of history of the term spirituality by Lucy Bregman. It's called The Ecology of Spirituality. It came out in 2014, I think. And, one of the things she documents in there is like, as of the, early 2000s, she kind of went back and tried to find like how this term has been used since the 80s. And she identifies, 92 different, versions of this term at work in sort of healthcare discourses, right, in business discourses and religious discourses and recreation discourse. It's a term that gets used in lots of different ways. So it's that's a long way of saying, like, I'm not sure that that's the term that's going to improve public discourse or make it clearer. Would the addition of the term make things better? Maybe, right? I actually think none is pretty good. I would have never said that. Like the first time I read the word none, I thought that was kind of a ridiculous way to categorize things. But having read some of the sociological work trying to capture that term, I don't know, I've kind of come around to thinking like, it does capture something important that I think, might improve discourse. In what kinds of ways? I think one of the problems is the kind of homogenation in the sense that, like, when we put a category on a group, right, then we can kind of talk about that group as if they were the same with respect to politics or the same with respect to, other categories we might be interested in. And so, having more categories and being able to split things up maybe is helpful to speak to the diversity of religious life in the United States and elsewhere. But yeah, I don't know. It's a hard question. I don't know. That's a couple of thoughts. But.
Yeah. I see, particularly because this is sort of some of the most public of discourse about religion happens in political and policy circles. And it looks like there is a recognition that the way that we do it isn't good, but the answers aren't good either. Going back 20 or 30 years, you see people replacing the term religion with faith-based, right? Which is, in all kinds of ways problematic about being built by people who are coming usually from Protestant Christian circles and have a particular idea about what that means.
Right.
And so it's, people trying to be more inclusive using that term, is just always been a little bit laughable.
Yeah.
So I think maybe if there's a silver lining, there is a recognition that we don't do this well, right? And maybe there's a desire to do it better. So I want to end up with a question I often end up with, which is, what am I missing here, right? Like, I have my particular perspective. I live in my own skin and see the world from my training and my own experiences. What am I missing about philosophy, religion, spirituality that would really, help our listeners understand what you're after, where you're going with the moves that you're making?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would just add, at the end that I didn't get a chance to say earlier, right? It was sort of thinking about some of the things that become highlighted or come to the fore when you sort of think about spirituality as opposed to religion. And one of the things that I was really surprised by was the sort of focus on desire, right? So, like, desire is something that philosophers have had a ton to say about over the years. And it's something that, people engaged in spiritual exercise have a ton to say about too, but I haven't seen those two literatures kind of come together at all, right? So, when you think about, Buddhist practices, right? One of the, it's not just Buddhist practices, but, practices based on the Upanishads and so on, right? You see this concern about attachment, right? And so I think that there's a sort of deep cross-cultural focus on the problems of desire, right? And overcoming it or taming it or getting rid of it, that I think I just haven't seen a lot of connection to the philosophical literature. I mean, this is an old issue, right? I mean, Plato is really, really concerned about desire, for example, right? And so are philosophers up through the ages. So, I think that's one place that I was really surprised to discover a real gap between sort of, we might think of as sort of spiritual literatures and sort of philosophical literatures that I think there's a fruitful opportunity to bring together. So that's one thing that I kind of would add on to the end of our conversation.
All right. Well, Tad Robinson, thank you so much for coming on Religion Wise. As always, it's been super fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
This has been Religion Wise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. Religion Wise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to Religion Wise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.